Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to touch on the issue of, which is going the rounds today, of reparations for black slaves. Now, it exclusively focuses on slaves only and on white slave owners only. So we can already tell from that it's a scam and a grift, but why aren't all other forms of slavery also considered? But so what we can be sure of, that it's part of a globalist coordinated grift, and all the Western governments, all the institutions, the entire media pack are telling the most outrageous lies and the most ridiculous untruths and the most fantastic fabrications. Now, if slavery was indeed as bad as they say, then they wouldn't need to tell any lies. The cold hard facts would speak for themselves, and that would be it. But that's not what they're doing. So just remember, when you hear all this talk about slavery and reparations, evil white people, victim blacks, just remember that the whole thing is a fabrication. Now, whether reparations are due is something that can be discussed in proper context. But the idea is to move wealth from people who have it to people who don't have it, and then use a pretext, an invented pretext to do it. It's the same sort of thing when say a divorce case goes on. The woman was penniless when she met the man. She's contributed absolutely nothing to the relationship in any financial sense. She's been spendthrift with money and careless with money. So has been, if anything, destructive to the amassing of wealth. But in spite of that, the hard-working, self-sacrificing husband has managed to buy a house and so on. So when they divorced, though, they said, well, look, she's really the victim and you're the fucking oppressor, you damn white fascist Nazi. So we're going to give her the house that you worked so hard for and she contributed nothing for, because it's fair, it's equitable. She was the oppressor and you were the damn fucking fascist, fucking white supremacist Nazi, and so on. So that's the narrative that they spin. So and it's really the same here when they use this in the wealth transfer thing. Now say in a fair world of divorce, where they'd say, okay, well, to what extent did the woman, did you contribute to the wealth? Okay, you were spendthrift, you were careless, you were constantly buying new lounge suites and new this and new that, and then throwing them out and buying other ones. You refused point blank to work, in spite of your husband, encouraging you and exhorting you to at least make some money. You refused to do it, and you were very wasteful on the relationship, and so on and so forth. So your entitlement, if any, has to be considered in that light. You brought no money to the relationship, and you've contributed nothing to the relationship. So your what you're going to take is going to be there. In fact, not only that, is given you've lived at his expense, we're going to apply a rent factor and a cost factor of what it cost him to feed you and house you and clothe you for that time, and we'll deduct that from any settlement as well. So, by the way, you get next to nothing. So like in a fair world, that's how it would work. You wouldn't be looking at oppressive victim. You wouldn't be approaching it from an ideological perspective. And not only is it an ideological approach on this slavery reparations thing, we know that it's done purposefully to demoralize Western white society and to create as much as to destroy social cohesion. So the trick is to stuff as many black people as you can into white society, and then to turn the blacks against the white people by saying they've been oppressing you. That's why you don't have a waterfront home. That's why you're not driving a Maserati. That's why you don't have the hot blonde chick as a wife. It's because those fucking Nazis, they fucking took it from you. Not only did they take it from you, they kept you in the dirt on the ground. They prevented you from having those things. And if they hadn't been doing that, you'd have the hot white chick as the wife now. You'd have the waterfront home. You'd have the luxury yacht. You'd have the Maserati. They stopped you from having it. Those fucking fascist Nazis. And they owe you. They fucking owe you for what you haven't had. So we're going to make sure they give it to you, those fucking damn Nazi fascist Hitlers. So that's the, when you're a simple low IQ person, you go, hey, yeah, that's why I don't have the waterfront home, because they fucking wouldn't let me have it, those motherfuckers. Yeah, so that's an easy sort of line to sell, and very Marxist. When Cuban agitators, Fidel Castro's Cuban agitators, went to Chile in the 1970s, when there was that Marxist Salvador Allende was standing for the office of president at the time. And so they sent these Cuban agitators all around the place, Marxist trained Cuban agitators, funded then by the Soviet Union. And they went around to all the peasants and the poor people and took them around to the wealthier suburbs and said, hey, you see that mansion there with that luxury swimming pool and all those hot chicks in swimming costumes hanging around there. That's going to be yours. If you vote for this Marxist guy, that will be yours. This will all belong to the people. The people will own all that. Now, to a simple peasant, you mean I can have a fucking waterfront mansion with a swimming pool, hot chicks swimming around? Hey, motherfucker, I'm voting for this guy. And that was the tactic that's used. And they're using that same Marxist simplistic tactic, to the black people to say, well, this can all be yours, and really, by the way, it's all been taken from you anyway. Now, the fact that there's no success, I don't think there's ever been in history a successful black society that's built wealth. The richest black societies that existed over history have either done so through genocidal conquest, which we don't hear about, or by having themselves enslaving their own fellow African blacks and selling them off to the Arabs and whoever wanted to buy them. So it was the slave trade that made, particularly down that east coast of Africa, closer to the Arabian Peninsula and so on. So that was all. That was all slave trade, as in selling slaves. So, but we don't hear about those sort of things these days. Now, if we look at slavery, and one of the things that constantly comes up, that particularly school kids, white school kids, because they've been trained to believe that only white people ever were involved in the slave trade and only black people were victims. So they're not taught about the history of slavery and anything about what labour and serfdom and so on and peasants, and they haven't been taught anything about that. They've been given this micro ideological fanatical window that it was only blacks as victims, only whites did it, which of course is an outrageous and grotesque untruth, but it's one that education departments all across the West push relentlessly. Now, some of the teachers I meet are so fucking stupid, maybe they do believe it, but there's plenty around that know it's untrue, but yet still do it. And that to me is unforgivable. So, if education is anything, it's teaching facts and so on, but it's being able to create the framework in a student's mind. Not every one of them is capable of this, but many are, to be able to think through complex issues and arrive at deductions based on the facts and the evidence. So, it's obvious that to anyone that looks at it, even on a superficial basis, that slavery has been around for a long time, well before white folks turned up. And it was only in the late 1400s that white people, and they were the first to acquire it, by the way, acquired the technology to develop long ocean-going vessels. This is vessels that wouldn't have to sail near to coastlines, which they nearly all did, but vessels that could go out into the open ocean and find new continents and new lands, new trade routes, and so on. It was only the West Europeans that developed this technology, and so then it was only that technology that made the transatlantic slave trade, at least, possible. But we need to see slavery in a wider context. Again, a lot of the younger people see it today. See the option that 1,000 years ago, the option people had was to work in a unionized factory 9 to 5, taking the bus there or the train with their government mandated hourly rates of pay, and they would have a very orderly existence, and they had all their rights, their rights were just 100% protected by law and by all these various institutions, trade unions, and so on and so forth. And there was either that perfect existence, as mostly that we know today, or recently it's disappearing, but that we know today, or slavery in chains, being whipped. It's one or the other. Nothing in between. That's it. Working in the factory or the office, nice air-conditioned office, nice clean clothes, 9 till 5 in an orderly existence, or ball and chain, being whipped, slavery out in the sun with no rights at all. That was it. Those were the options. Isn't it terrible that they were treated that way when they should have been in their air-conditioned office with their union negotiating their fucking hourly rates of pay? I mean, no. Wait a minute, wait, stop. Those things didn't even exist. The unions and hourly rates of pay, this didn't even exist back then. So the sort of orderly world of employment and union influence, government mandated rates of pay, and taxation, and all this sort of stuff, employment tribunals and the like. That's fairly recent. That's all come on in certainly within the last 100, maybe 110 years, and even then there were very few countries that were had that situation. You'd see the beginning of it in places like Britain and Western Europe, parts of Germany, France, the United States, that sort of thing. There were really only half a dozen or so, certainly less than 10 countries in the entire world that even had the slightest semblance of those industrial relations laws, employment laws, hourly rates of pay. What today we regard as just how things are, but there was very few. So typically throughout history, the existence of the average person who's not an aristocrat, the existence has been one of serfdom. Now, the difference between serfdom and slavery was fairly slight, actually. It wasn't a whole lot. With serfdom, you were effectively owned by the aristocrat, because all the lands were owned by the aristocrats, so you worked on the aristocrats' land. Now, sure, there were certain obligations. They had to provide you with some sort of shelter from your labour on that, the various plot. You were allocated a small plot of land, and you had to grow your own food on that, and then you could go out and say in a place like England that had fairly small population for a while, you go out and hunt, rabbits or something, whatever, game, and use that to supplement your diet. But really, you were effectively a slave. You couldn't move to another township or region without the express written permission of the aristocrat. You couldn't marry without the express written. You couldn't procreate, and there's a whole lot of things. You were owned by the aristocrat. Now, technically, you were free. You weren't a slave in the exact and precise terms of a slave, but it was as good as being a slave. You had slightly more rights, but really there wasn't much in it. That you weren't being picked up from one place, that you maybe were born in or grew up, and you weren't picked up and then put in another place. That was a difference of slavery. But in terms of that, you were required to work and exist at the I don't know what you call it, the arbitrary discretion of the aristocrat. That's the same in slavery and in serfdom. So now, if you look at, say, other things. You had some sort of private ownership in serfdom, not much, but you had some sort of private ownership, but that was soaked up by monopoly control. For example, if you wanted to grind your grain to make bread, there was only one grinding mill, and that could be a water wheel grinding mill, or maybe like windmill driven, something like that, or even horse drawn. But you couldn't own a horse. All the horses were owned by the aristocrats. So if you wanted to grind your grain for making bread, then you had to use the aristocrats' resources. If you wanted to take any surplus produce to markets, I don't know, your apples or your oranges, whatever, apples and pears and so on, you had to take them to the markets. Then the horse and cart you used had to be the aristocrats, and you had to pay for that, and that was typically a proportion of your. So if you had 100 apples to sell at the market, you may have to give 20 of them to the aristocrat, for example, 20 of them to the aristocrat as payment for use of the horse and cart. So the difference between serfdom, which pretty much everyone was a serf, that like 99% of the population was serfs. So they and again, the difference between serfdom and slavery was almost none. Now the other thing was, and you'd see this in the early time of the American colonies before they became independent, or even afterwards for that matter, was an indentured servant. Now this would typically happen where there was some sort of training involved. So say, I don't know, like a table maker or a chair maker or whatever, the equivalent to what you'd call an apprenticeship, really. Now, somebody would be apprenticed at quite a young age, 12, 13, and they would be given passage say from England, for example, or Ireland, Scotland, the British Isles. They would be given a paid passage to the United States. So their employer at the other end would pay the ship to bring these apprentices out. Now, the apprentice, the employer has gone to considerable cost here. When the apprentice arrives, they have to be given somewhere to live. It wouldn't be a luxurious quarters, but they'd be given a little room somewhere, and clothes, and they'd have to be fed. And this is and on top of that, they're not particularly productive while the employer is training them in the trade or the craft or whatever it is. So those costs were something that the employer bore. So the apprentice coming out would be indentured to the employer. So the employer would effectively own them as a slave, give or take, as a slave for could be 10, 12, 15 years or longer, until the apprentice had paid back all the money that the employer had spent on and became productive in their own right and was making a surplus profit for their employer. And then from that surplus profit, the employer would effectively get the payback. So those payback periods, depending on how much the employer had shelled out in the first place, could be quite a bit. Now, some simple people, kids would be suckered in there. The employer may give them a nicer room, or may give them nicer clothes to wear, or nicer shoes with shinier buckles, or something like that. But that would all be accounted for. So their apprenticeship then their indenturement rather could go from 15 years originally agreed to 20 years. So, well, I gave you all that extra food, I gave you those nice clothes. That was another 5 years, buddy. You owe me. So really, at the time of indenturement, you can't move anywhere else. You can't go anywhere. You have very limited freedom. You have some rights, but you wouldn't have enough money to employ a lawyer. And if you did, you did feel that you were being transgressed against or hard done by, assuming you could even get a lawyer, then it would be very difficult for you to stay. You'd almost be outcast in society. So it wouldn't have been a worthwhile move anyway. You might once you're in that situation, you might as well just go through with it and finish it. Now, as today, there's plenty of slavery going on today. As today and as then, there are scams. People will be falling, getting a little bit too clever and will be trying to exploit the various systems that were available, but bypass laws and so on. And there were laws against the mistreatment of apprentices and those indentured, but really there are only three, unless you were very well to do. There are only three forms of employment. There was serfdom, and there was two forms: serfdom and indenturement. And the difference between those and slavery was was very slim indeed. You'd struggle to find daylight between the three of them. So we need to see that in context. That slavery was was probably the primary labour exchange of the day. There was a shortage of labour. This is pre-industrial age, of course, and even into the industrial age. There was a shortage of labour everywhere. And as the new lands in the Americas and so on were being opened up, there was also a shortage of labour, particularly a shortage of labour in those places. So the only way you could make up that shortfall was through moving people in. So what today we call slavery, but at the time it was seen as a labour exchange. And you know, morally, the white people that were again the only ones that had the technology for the long ocean-going vessels, they would purchase the slaves from black slave traders or Arab slave traders. So they weren't going out into the jungles of Africa and randomly grabbing black people. It just never happened that way. They were conducting a commercial transaction with people, with other black slavers that were selling their own people to the whites. So this idea that it was some sort of white thing was just bullshit, absolute bullshit. So that needs to be taken into account, which it isn't. Those things are just neatly avoided or skirted around. So when the black and the reason the blacks were particularly picked because they were hardy and resistant to European diseases and to tropical diseases that killed the Europeans off. And also they were capable of the heavy work that farm labouring involved. So a lot of the other races couldn't do that sort of work, or were deemed inappropriate for it, or too susceptible to diseases. So there were a number of reasons why it ended up as black people. But similarly, the propensity of the black people to sell their own people as slaves really is what clinched it. That's the important thing. Now, coming to the idea of blacks would have been very rich and well off if not for the white people. That's an absolute and grotesque lie. There has not been, that I can detect, there's not been a single successful black society ever in the history of the world, unless it's been through selling other blacks as slaves, or say in the case of the Zulus, where they were genocidally killing off other black tribes in South East Africa at the time. So this idea that the blacks would have been rich and prosperous if only the whites hadn't come along is one of the most grotesque untruths doing the rounds of the propaganda machinery at the moment. There is not a single black society that's been successful. And if you look at all black societies today, even in countries that are fantastically rich in natural resources, they're still basket cases. You look at the African countries that have received almost an ending stream of billions upon billions of dollars of United Nations and Western aid. Again, they're still basket cases. And then if you look at the idea of the blacks in the United States saying that they're due reparations, the United States blacks per capita are the richest black people in the world. There's none even come close per capita. So this idea, they're already the richest black people in the world. So the idea that compensation should be added to that is just absurd. So those are my thoughts and opinions. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.